I use ecological dynamics as an underpinning for how and why I behave, and recently inside of Discord I was asked, what does that mean? How do you do it? How does it work when I put it into practice for research? And that's what I want to cover in this video. There are three main steps or areas or things that I go through when I see a paper or I see an article or I read something or I listen to something, and that's what I'm going to discuss right now. You can see in the Obsidian file there's an outline summary for you for those that like to use AI to summarize the video, but essentially finding various solutions and not answers is what ecological dynamics tries to encourage. If you're interested in the philosophical and psychological elements of ecological psychology and dynamical systems theory, the two areas that ecological dynamics bring together, then I've done a video on my other channel, which I'll link at the top, which goes into all of the depth of the stuff. But essentially, we all behave for a reason. We are goal-directed individuals, and so whenever I see a piece of content or I think about something or I'm thinking about a question, I ask myself, what is the point? What is the point of me continually either continuing to think about thing or continuing to read the thing or continuing to listen to thing? What is the point? It could be personal, i.e. learning. There could be a personal development, personal element, personal interest, personal something about it. Or there could be a professional element about it, such as making content or doing something inside of work for it, whether it's answering questions, a way to talk with people, a way to coach people. But of course, in an ideal world, you'd want a bit of both. Something that is personally interesting, but also professionally useful. So that's the first thing that I ask myself when there is a decision to be made about whether I consume a piece of content or whether I leave that piece of content, whether I continually research something or whether I put it to the side. So if I can't answer that question within the first couple of seconds, or what is the point of doing this, I hold that decision and I put it somewhere else. Most of the time it's inside of Morgan because I like to keep things centralized, and Morgan is where I manage my time, which relates to the second point. Consumable. Question mark. Now, consumable, readable, actionable, doable, graspable, all of these sorts of things in ecological psychology are termed affordances. Affordances are invitations or opportunities for action, for behavior. Something is graspable, so I can grasp this glass. It's reachable, it's graspable. That's where the consumable and readable questions come from. But how does that actually work in practice? What am I doing that is graspable or readable? Well, it's whether, when, and how to behave, to act, to do something. So whether you are able to do it, maybe you are not physically capable of doing something for some reason, you're not able to get to a certain place, or there could be too much complexity in that situation, in the relationship in that situation, so you'd need to learn something so you can make it easier, or maybe make it harder because it's boring. So for example, if there is a short piece of content that is very shallow, very broad, it could be quite boring, so I ask whether I could make this more complex and ask other questions. Or on the other side of that, maybe it's a very deep, complex conversation about a topic I'm unfamiliar with. I may want to simplify that and just focus on a couple of bits, a couple of seconds, a couple of minutes, or dive in deep into one sentence, one question, one idea that they mention. But then I need to work out when to do that, so that's time related. And that is why all of these decisions are put inside of Morgan, because Morgan is where I manage all of my time. Something that is 10 minutes and half an hour or an hour will take up time in my day, which at the end of the day will remove time from something else. If you're doing something, you can't do something else. Your focus needs to be split. And so while perceiving affordances of whether content is consumable, I'm asking these questions. Is it consumable? Yes, because I understand this topic. So whether, yes, I can do it. When, well, actually I might need to do it at another time, so it goes into Morgan as a decision-making tool, or more of an aid because I'm the one still making the decision, but it can aid my suggestions in when to do it, looking at all of the other things, tasks, behaviors, goal-directed behaviors that I'm looking to do for work and all the volunteering that I do. And then of course there is the how, which in research cases is the medium. Is the medium written text? Is it auditory? Am I watching something? Is it visual on screen? But then also, is it asynchronized? So am I watching something and then doing something else, i.e. writing notes and pausing it and rewinding? Or is it more of a synchronized conversation, a live conversation that I'm having with someone? Is that in person? Is that on camera? Am I going somewhere? Which now changes whether I can do it? Am I able to travel to wherever it is? And this all encompasses the affordances that I'm perceiving for action, whether I'm actually going to do it. So what is the point, and whether, when, and how I can do that? Which brings me to practice design. How do I set up my environment, my relationship with the environment, using constraints to help me get this thing done? When I'm coaching sport, I use practice design to create problems for individuals to explore potential solutions. They're exploring solutions to problems I set, but because I am coaching myself, I'm the one setting the problems. If I have a problem and I have a piece of content that may solve that problem, how do I design the practice to help me move forwards? Whether that is answer one question, answer lots of questions, gain a deeper understanding in a specific part of the piece of content. Well, now I need to constrain my practice design. Only read a certain section, only listen to a certain part, only dive in on one idea, one concept, or maybe I want a much broader view, which is going to take more time. And so my practice design now is, instead of a half-hour slot on my calendar, it's a whole week-long project, or maybe a month project. Maybe you're writing a book and the practice design is a year. All of this practice design, for me, is constructed through constraints. Person constraints, so what I'm physically constrained to do. That could be because I'm half deaf, I'm half blind, which limits me from doing certain things, but then also I'm not as tall or as short or as big, so physical constraints inside of research isn't as significant. But if I need to travel somewhere, this is a constraint that could impact my access. But then we have the task constraint. And in my other contexts, so sports coaching and volunteering, the task constraint is often given by the coach, i.e. me, and then the practitioners will work around it. They are normally rules or guidelines in the game or in the practice that we've constructed. But in this case, it's me. So what task constraints do I add? Those would be the, do I read or look at or consume all of it, or none of it, or some of it? And those task constraints will increase or decrease depending on the complexity, which relates back to the affordances. Whether, when, and how, whether I can do it. Well, if it's a really complex topic, maybe I want to reduce, i.e. add constraints, and reduce the amount that I'm reading or watching. So I'm using the constraints to adjust whether, when, and how I can do it to make it useful, i.e. what's the point? And then there are environmental constraints, which most of the time for me are fairly static. But if we lose electricity, or I can't store certain things on my computer, or I've run out of storage, or something crashes and the internet goes down, or Obsidian breaks, which it hasn't done, but it might do. Or more practically, if I go away and I can't use cloud services, like when I used to use Notion, that's an environmental constraint, which adjusts my practice design. Obsidian, I don't have that issue because it's local, so I can use it on my phone, or I use it on the computer. But on my phone, there is an environmental constraint in that, obviously, the app is different on my phone than on my computer, which may mean I want to adjust how I'm doing something again, whether, when, and how I'm going to do it. But for me, and I imagine most people, they can look at a video or read an article or look at the abstract and decide, yeah, that's readable or that's not readable, or I need to do that at another point in time. It's whether, when, and how they do it that may get confusing, which is where I use Morgan to assist with time management and helping to make those decisions with everything else that's going on, to give me a scope, a broad scope of what it is that I need to do. And Obsidian is what I use for all of the research and the projects. If I go into my research projects file, you can see I've got loads of projects in here, many of which, as I go through these different points, I go back to what is the point. And if there isn't a significant point to doing that research project at that time, I don't do it. And it sits there and it waits. And then I go back to things later on when I ask myself whether, when, and how I can do this, and then I create a practice design, i.e. it goes into Morgan, and then there is time set for me to do some of the work depending on the complexity of the research project. Decision making is very complex and very unique to each individual because there's a relationship between the organism and the environment which adjusts depending on how you're acting in the world. So I tried to explain ecological dynamics in a simple-ish way in this video and how I use it to do research, but I use ecological dynamics to underpin all of my actions. So any decision that I make is underpinned by this rough three-step process. It's not really 1, 2, 3 because you could go 3, 2, 1 or 2, 1, 3. It's a roundabout, but hopefully that gave a bit of insight in the way that I make decisions.